4 things spiritually awakened people let go of. First, Carl Jung's shocking truth. Most people think awakening means adding more knowledge, more light, more peace. But the truth is the opposite. Real awakening begins with letting go layer by layer until there's nothing left but the truth of who you are. As Carl Jung revealed, your awakening isn't about becoming more spiritual. It's about surrendering everything that keeps you asleep. In this video, we'll explore the 4 illusions spiritually awakened people release. First, the ego's need for control, the hunger for validation, the attachment to pain, and finally, the illusion of separation. Because the moment you let go of these, you don't lose yourself, you return to yourself. Part 1. The illusion of control, letting go of the ego's grip. The first thing spiritually awakened people let go of is the illusion of control. For Carl Jung, this illusion is the most seductive mask of the ego, a defense mechanism designed to protect us from the anxiety of uncertainty. The ego wants to believe it is the master of life, that it can predict outcomes, shape destinies, and bend reality through willpower. But the deeper one travels into the unconscious, the more fragile that illusion becomes. Jung saw that the need to control everything is in truth a symptom of spiritual immaturity, a resistance to the natural flow of the self. Control is the language of fear. When a person feels powerless or disconnected from their inner world, the psyche compensates by tightening its grip on the external. They plan excessively, they overanalyze, they manipulate, they obsess over how others perceive them. Jung would call this an over-identification with the ego complex, the small I that believes it stands separate from the vastness of life. This identification breeds anxiety because the ego is finite and reality is infinite. It's like trying to hold the ocean in your hands. The tighter you squeeze, the faster it slips away. The spiritually awakened person begins to see this dynamic, not through theory, but through experience. They suffer enough disappointments, failed plans, and unexpected turns to finally realize life cannot be controlled, only lived. This realization is painful because it dismantles the illusion of safety. But it is also liberating because it marks the beginning of true surrender, not surrender as defeat but as alignment. Jung used the term participation mystique to describe a lost psychological condition where early humanity felt one with nature and the cosmos. In awakening, a person slowly regains a sense of that mystical participation, but consciously. To do so, they must first let go of the ego's compulsive need to dominate. The ego's obsession with control has its roots in fear of the unconscious. Jung said that the unconscious is both creative and destructive, and because the ego cannot predict it, it tries to suppress it. We resist our dreams, ignore intuition, and avoid emotions that feel overwhelming. But what is repressed does not disappear. It becomes autonomous. It gains power in the dark. The more the ego resists, the more the unconscious retaliates through anxiety, compulsions, or fate-like events. Jung famously said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." Control, then, is the ego's futile attempt to avoid that confrontation. It's the mind's way of saying, if I can manage everything out there, I won't have to face what's in here. Spiritually awakened people begin to see the trap. They recognize that their suffering does not come from the events of life, but from their resistance to them. Jung would say that neurosis is born from the refusal to accept legitimate suffering. Life's unpredictability is not the problem. Our attempt to control it is. When a person clings to control, they are essentially fighting against the self, the totality of their being. The self, according to Jung, seeks wholeness, not perfection. It uses both light and shadow, joy and pain, to bring the ego into harmony. To the ego, this process feels like chaos. To the self, it is creation. Letting go of control is not about becoming passive or careless. It's about shifting from manipulation to cooperation. The awakened person learns to act with intention but without attachment to outcome. Jung often described this as the transcendent function, the inner process that reconciles opposites. When the ego stops trying to dominate the unconscious and instead learns to dialogue with it, something higher emerges. Decisions come not from anxiety but from intuition. Actions are guided not by fear but by alignment. The person begins to live from the center of their being, not the surface. Consider how control operates in everyday life. The ego wants to control relationships, how others behave, what they think, how they feel about us. It wants to control success, timing, recognition, and results. It even tries to control spirituality, turning awakening into a checklist of techniques, mantras, and milestones. But all of this control is the opposite of awakening. Jung saw this in his patients who approached individuation as a project rather than a transformation. They wanted enlightenment without surrender, light without shadow. Yet the psyche does not yield to control. It yields to honesty. The moment one admits "I don't know," the unconscious begins to cooperate. There is a paradox at the heart of letting go. The more one surrenders, the more one discovers true power. Not power over, but power through. This is the power of the self, the energy that moves through us when we stop resisting. Jung compared it to a river. The ego can build dams and try to redirect the flow, but the water will eventually find its path. The spiritually awakened person becomes the river, not the dam. They trust that life's current, however unpredictable, is intelligent. Control is replaced by participation. One of Jung's most profound insights is that control is rooted in projection. The ego projects its inner chaos onto the outer world and then tries to manage it externally. A person obsessed with controlling others is usually avoiding their own insecurity or unresolved trauma. For example, a perfectionist might appear disciplined, but is often driven by deep shame. A controlling parent may rationalize their behavior as love, but beneath it lies fear of inadequacy. The awakened person recognizes these projections and withdraws them. They realize that the world is not something to be fixed, but something to be understood, and that understanding begins within. Letting go of control also requires confronting the archetype of the hero, the part of us that wants to conquer, save, and achieve. Jung admired the hero archetype for its courage, but warned that it must eventually die for the self to be born. The hero believes it can master life through effort. The awakened soul learns instead to collaborate with life. The shift is subtle but profound, from striving to allowing, from dominance to dialogue. In this humility, wisdom begins to grow. The process is not easy. The ego resists surrender because it equates control with survival. Biologically, our nervous system is wired to seek predictability. Uncertainty triggers the amygdala, releasing cortisol and adrenaline. Psychologically, this translates into control behavior, planning, worrying, micromanaging. But spiritual growth demands tolerance for uncertainty. Jung believed that the capacity to hold tension between known and unknown, comfort and fear, is the mark of maturity. When the ego can sit in that tension without collapsing into panic, it opens space for transformation. This is what Jung called holding the opposites. Spiritually awakened people often describe a phase where everything they built begins to fall apart. Careers, relationships, beliefs all crumble. It's not punishment, it's purification. The psyche dismantles everything that was built on illusion. Jung called this the night sea journey, a descent into the unconscious where the old self dies so that a truer self may emerge. During this phase, the illusion of control is shattered. The person realizes that no amount of planning can prevent change, no strategy can stop loss, and no logic can fully explain life. The only path forward is surrender, not the resignation of defeat, but the acceptance of mystery. This surrender transforms the relationship with fear. Control once served as armor against the unknown, but now the awakened person learns to face uncertainty directly. They discover that fear is not an enemy but a messenger. It points to the parts of themselves still disconnected from the self. Jung said that fear is the natural response of the ego encountering something larger than itself. When one stops fleeing that fear and listens, the unconscious begins to reveal its wisdom. Through dreams, synchronicities, and inner symbols, the psyche communicates guidance. Life becomes less about control and more about communication with the unseen. Letting go of control also alters how we perceive time. The ego lives in linear time, past and future. It clings to memory and expectation. The awakened mind begins to live in kairos, the timeless present. Jung described this as a movement from outer time chronos to inner time kairos. When you stop trying to control outcomes, you start noticing the intelligence of timing. Events unfold with uncanny synchronicity. People appear at the right moment, opportunities align effortlessly, and obstacles become teachers. This doesn't mean passivity, it means participation in a living pattern greater than one's personal agenda. Jung often warned about spiritual inflation, the ego's attempt to appropriate awakening. It says, "I am enlightened now, I can manifest anything." But this is just control disguised as spirituality. The awakened soul recognizes that surrender is ongoing. There is no final mastery, only deeper cooperation with the self. The ego will always try to reassert control, and that's natural. What changes is awareness. You catch yourself grasping sooner, you release faster, you laugh more easily at your own illusions. The battle between ego and self becomes a dance. From a depth psychology perspective, letting go of control also means releasing the attachment to should. The word should is the ego's attempt to impose order on yourself, on others, on life. I should be farther along. They should understand me. Life should be fair. Each should is a micro-control. The awakened person begins to replace should with is. They observe without judgment. This doesn't make them indifferent. It makes them receptive. They see reality as it is, not as they wish it to be. In this acceptance, they gain access to authentic response instead of reactive control. Another layer of control comes through perfectionism. Jung saw perfectionism as a distortion of the archetype of the self. The self seeks wholeness, the integration of all parts. The ego, misunderstanding this, seeks flawlessness. But wholeness includes imperfection. It honors contrast. Spiritually awakened individuals realize that trying to perfect life is a form of resistance to life. They stop polishing their image and start embracing authenticity. They stop trying to fix every emotion and start listening to it. As Jung noted, even a happy life cannot be without a measure of darkness. Control denies darkness. Awakening integrates it. The loss of control also redefines success. Before awakening, success means achievement, recognition, dominance. After awakening, it means alignment, peace, authenticity. The awakened person acts but not to prove worth. They act because it feels true. They trust that the results belong to something larger than themselves. Jung described this as moving from the ego ideal to the self-ideal. The ego ideal is driven by comparison and ambition. The self-ideal is guided by vocation, the inner calling of the soul. When control fades, vocation emerges. Life becomes a conversation between inner necessity and outer opportunity. Letting go of control also transforms relationships. People who awaken stop trying to fix, rescue, or change others. They realize that each person has their own journey of individuation. This can feel lonely at first, especially for empathic personalities. But it's a sacred loneliness, the solitude of authenticity. Jung wrote that individuation requires standing alone, free from the collective's expectations. In this solitude, one learns that love is not control or dependency, it's recognition. You no longer love someone because they fit your idea of them, but because you see them as they are. True intimacy replaces manipulation. In Jungian terms, letting go of control also involves confronting the trickster archetype, the chaotic energy that disrupts order. The trickster breaks your plans, exposes hypocrisy, and forces humility. At first, this archetype feels like a curse. Later, it's seen as grace. Every unforeseen event, every mistake becomes part of the soul's curriculum. The awakened person learns to laugh at the trickster, not curse it. This laughter marks a profound stage of psychological freedom. When you can laugh at life's unpredictability, you are no longer its prisoner. The illusion of control is also deeply tied to collective conditioning. Society rewards control, control over image, productivity, emotions. Children are praised for being disciplined, not for being intuitive. Adults are measured by how well they manage outcomes. But Jung believed that what is praised socially often leads to repression psychologically. A society obsessed with control breeds anxiety and disconnection. The spiritually awakened individual begins to see through this collective hypnosis. They start valuing presence over performance, authenticity over appearance. Their life becomes quieter but more real. Letting go of control does not mean chaos, it means coherence. In Jungian language, the ego becomes the servant of the self rather than its tyrant. It still plans, organizes, and acts, but in harmony with inner guidance. You still drive the car, but you no longer believe you are the road. You trust the terrain even when it curves into the unknown. This is psychological maturity. The ego learns to cooperate with forces greater than itself. Jung called this the ego, self-axis, the dynamic relationship between the conscious and the unconscious. When this axis is balanced, life feels guided rather than forced. Over time, the awakened person notices subtle shifts. They stop reacting impulsively when things go wrong. They stop seeking constant assurance. They find beauty in uncertainty, lessons in delay, and grace in imperfection. Their nervous system calms because the psyche no longer fights the natural flow. They begin to experience synchronicities, those meaningful coincidences Jung described as signs of alignment with the self. What once seemed random now feels orchestrated by an unseen intelligence. The person realizes letting go of control doesn't mean losing direction. It means discovering the deeper compass within. Ultimately, the illusion of control dissolves not through theory, but through trust. Trust is the psychological opposite of control. It arises when the ego recognizes its limits and allows the self to guide. This trust cannot be forced. It grows through experience, through the repeated discovery that life continues even when plans fail, that meaning emerges even from chaos. Jung said that the self is like God within the psyche, an organizing principle beyond conscious will. To trust life, then, is to trust the self. The awakened person doesn't control life. They collaborate with its mystery. And so the first act of spiritual awakening is not to gain something, but to release something, the illusion that we are in charge. In Jung's terms, it is the descent of the ego into humility, the recognition that we are participants, not puppeteers. The river of life flows with or without our consent, but once we stop fighting it, it begins to carry us exactly where we were meant to go all along. Part 2. The need for external validation, reclaiming inner authority. After a spiritually awakened person releases the illusion of control, the next thing they let go of is the need for external validation. This is one of the deepest ego attachments, and Jung understood it as a symptom of a psyche that has not yet fully differentiated from the collective. The desire to be approved, to be seen as good, right, or worthy, it is not merely a social instinct, it is a spiritual wound. It reveals the extent to which the individual's sense of identity depends on others' perception. In Jung's view, the psyche develops a persona, a mask designed to interact with the world. The persona is necessary. It allows us to function within society, but it is not the self. Problems arise when the ego identifies with the persona, mistaking social acceptance for authenticity. The spiritually unawakened person believes, often unconsciously, that their worth is conditional based on performance, attractiveness, popularity, or virtue. They become enslaved to the eyes of others, constantly adjusting their behavior to fit expectations. This is what Jung called participation mystique, in a modern form, not mystical unity with nature, but unconscious fusion with the social collective. When you live for others' approval, you live in their psyche, not your own. Your center of gravity lies outside of you. Every compliment becomes nourishment, every criticism poison. You oscillate between inflation and collapse depending on the feedback loop. Spiritually awakened people begin to notice this fluctuation and grow weary of it. They realize that validation feels good but never lasts. It's a drug with diminishing returns. The need for validation stems from a primal wound, the loss of unconditional acceptance. In childhood, many people learn that love must be earned through obedience, achievement, or pleasing behavior. Jung saw that these early experiences shaped the ego complex, creating what he called inferiority feelings. The ego, sensing its smallness before the vastness of life, constructs defenses to appear significant. External validation temporarily soothes that inferiority, but it also strengthens dependence. The more you seek affirmation, the more you confirm your lack of self-trust. The awakened individual begins to see this pattern clearly, and that clarity is the beginning of liberation. Letting go of validation does not mean rejecting connection, it means reclaiming authorship of your own worth. Jung would say that the task is not to destroy the persona, but to relativize it, to know when you are wearing it. The persona is useful in certain contexts, work, community, or family. But beyond those roles, there is the self, the inner core, that does not need to perform. Spiritually awakened people start noticing how often they perform unconsciously, saying yes when they mean no, smiling to avoid tension, posting online for attention rather than expression. Each moment of awareness chips away at the mask. Gradually, authenticity replaces approval as the guiding principle. Jung wrote that the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. Most people never reach this point because their self-concept depends on others' reflections. When you stop chasing validation, you face the void, the space where no one is clapping. At first it feels like death because the persona is dying, but this is necessary death, the dissolution of false identity. The spiritually awakened person sits in that silence and begins to feel something deeper, inner authority. It's not loud or dramatic. It's quiet, like a still voice that says, "I am enough because I exist." In Jungian terms, this marks the shift from the ego ideal to the self. The ego ideal is an image of perfection imposed by culture, religion, or family. It's who you think you should be. The self, on the other hand, is who you actually are, a totality that includes both light and shadow. To awaken, you must betray the ego ideal. You must risk being misunderstood, disliked, or rejected. Jung called this individuation the process of becoming who you are meant to be, not who the world wants you to be. Every act of authenticity is a small death of the false self, and every death of the false self births freedom. People who are awakening often experience social friction. They lose interest in pleasing everyone. They withdraw from gossip drama and performative morality. Friends or family may accuse them of becoming distant or arrogant, but in truth they are becoming centered. Jung observed that the individuating person often feels isolated because they no longer share the collective illusions that once provided belonging. This loneliness is not pathological, it is sacred. It signals the emergence of inner wholeness. You stop needing to belong everywhere because you finally belong to yourself. The addiction to validation also appears in subtler forms, spiritual validation, for example. Many seekers trade worldly approval for spiritual superiority. They want to be seen as enlightened, kind, or awakened. They turn spirituality into a new mask. Jung warned about this phenomenon, which he called spiritual inflation. The ego identifies with archetypal forces, the sage, the healer, the prophet, and mistakes them for personal achievements. The cure again is humility, remembering that the self works through you, not because of you. The truly awakened person does not announce their awakening, they embody it quietly. Another dimension of this pattern is moral validation. People often build their self-worth on being good, kind, or selfless. But Jung argued that goodness without awareness becomes repression. When you deny your aggression, jealousy, or desire, you project those traits onto others. You judge them to preserve your self-image. The awakened individual stops playing this game. They stop needing to appear pure and start embracing complexity. They know that light without shadow is an illusion. True morality arises not from external approval, but from internal integration. It's not about being good, it's about being whole. Releasing the need for validation requires courage, because it dismantles the social scaffolding of identity. Jung said that the shoe that fits one person pinches another. There is no recipe for living that suits all cases. The awakening person begins to craft their own values independent of collective norms. This autonomy is what Jung called authentic morality, an ethic born from inner conviction rather than conformity. When you act from inner authority, your actions may still upset others, but they carry integrity. The outer world might disapprove, but the inner world nods in agreement. That nod becomes enough. From a psychological perspective, validation seeking is linked to projection and transference. We project our inner authority onto figures of power, parents, teachers, partners, or even spiritual leaders. We want them to tell us who we are and whether we are enough. Jung saw this in the therapeutic relationship. Patients often transfer the archetype of the wise old man or the great mother onto the analyst. Healing begins when those projections are withdrawn and reintegrated. Similarly, in life, awakening begins when we stop outsourcing our worth. The authority we once projected outward is reclaimed inward. We become the parent, teacher, and guide we were seeking. The absence of validation reveals the shadow. When no one is watching, who are you? When no one praises you, do you still act with integrity? When no one believes in you, can you still trust your path? These questions mark the testing ground of individuation. Jung noted that the shadow is not just negative. It contains potential authenticity, creativity, power. By confronting our craving for validation, we recover the energy we once gave away to approval. That energy fuels creation rather than performance. The artist no longer paints to impress, they paint to express. The healer no longer helps to be admired, they help because it's their nature. Letting go of validation also changes the relationship with failure. When your self-worth depends on external approval, failure feels fatal. But when your value comes from inner authority, failure becomes feedback. Jung described this as the movement from ego-centered consciousness to self-centered consciousness. In ego-centered living, every setback threatens identity. In self-centered living, every setback becomes instruction. The awakened person stops fearing disapproval because they no longer depend on it for orientation. Their compass is internal. In Jung's symbolic language, this stage corresponds to the encounter with the anima or animus, the inner opposite. The anima in men and animus in women represent the bridge between ego and self, between rational consciousness and the unconscious. When the need for validation fades, the individual begins to form a relationship with this inner figure. Instead of seeking affirmation from external lovers or authorities, they receive it from within. Dreams often reflect this transformation, the appearance of an inner guide, a mysterious partner, or a luminous child. These are symbols of psychological integration. They signify that the soul no longer seeks outside what it has found inside. The process also dismantles codependent relationships. Many people confuse love with validation. They equate being needed with being valued. Jung saw that this dynamic arises from unconscious projection. Each partner mirrors the other's disowned qualities. When awakening occurs, projections withdraw and relationships either deepen or dissolve. The awakened person no longer tolerates conditional love. They begin to communicate honestly, to set boundaries, to prioritize authenticity over harmony. This can create temporary chaos, but it also births real intimacy connection without manipulation. Social media amplifies the collective addiction to validation. Jung would have seen it as a vast psychic theater where personas compete for recognition. Likes, followers, and shares function as symbolic energy, modern forms of libidinal exchange. The more you feed the persona, the weaker the self becomes. Spiritually awakened individuals often feel repelled by this dynamic. They may withdraw from constant posting or begin using these platforms with awareness, expressing rather than performing. They realize that genuine influence comes not from visibility, but from authenticity. The energy of truth has its own frequency. The craving for validation is also a defense against shame. Jung noted that shame arises when we reject aspects of ourselves that don't fit the collective ideal. We then seek validation to compensate for that inner rejection. But the cure for shame is not approval, it's self-acceptance. Spiritually awakened people confront their shame directly. They bring light into the hidden chambers of the psyche. They realize that everyone carries wounds, contradictions, and imperfections. In that realization, compassion arises first for oneself, then for others. Validation becomes unnecessary because belonging is internal. Reclaiming inner authority also means trusting intuition. Jung described intuition as the function of perception through the unconscious, the mind's way of reading symbolic information. When we depend on external validation, we override intuition in favor of social logic. We doubt ourselves, second-guess feelings, and look for consensus. Awakening restores trust in the inner compass. The voice of intuition becomes louder than the noise of approval. Decisions are made not to please, but to align. This alignment often leads down unconventional paths, but they feel unmistakably alive. As the need for validation dissolves, humility deepens. Paradoxically, when you no longer need to prove your worth, you begin to recognize the worth in everyone else. Jung said that individuation leads to compassion because it reconciles opposites. You no longer see others as competitors for validation. You see them as mirrors of the same divine process. This changes the tone of your relationships and your energy. You don't enter rooms to impress or dominate. You enter to connect. The absence of validation seeking creates presence, a quiet power that speaks for itself. From a depth psychological lens, validation seeking is a symptom of a weak ego. The healthy ego, Jung said, is not inflated or deflated. It is transparent to the self. It knows its place as a vessel of expression, not as the source of value. When the ego matures, it stops begging for approval because it recognizes its partnership with something eternal. The person who once chased applause begins to find fulfillment in silence. The need to be someone fades. The joy of being increases. This doesn't mean the ego disappears, it transforms. The ego becomes a servant of the soul, not its master. You still appreciate recognition, but you no longer depend on it. You can accept praise without attachment and criticism without collapse. You move through life with emotional independence. Jung referred to this as psychic wholeness. When the opposites within are integrated, external opinions lose their grip. Your peace no longer depends on the weather of social approval. It's anchored in the inner climate of authenticity. Spiritually awakened people begin to measure life differently. Instead of asking, "Do they like me?" they ask, "Is this true to me?" Instead of chasing status, they pursue meaning. Instead of seeking attention, they seek depth. Jung believed that meaning is the antidote to neurosis. When your life expresses meaning, validation becomes irrelevant. The energy that once went into proving yourself now goes into creating, serving, and being. You live for expression, not impression. In many ways, letting go of validation is a rite of passage, the movement from psychological adolescence to adulthood. Adolescence is about fitting in. Maturity is about standing alone. Jung said, the individual must be willing to step into the desert of their own soul. That desert can feel empty at first, but it's where you discover your voice. When you speak from that place, even a whisper carries weight. You no longer shout to be heard. Truth amplifies itself. As this transformation deepens, the awakened person begins to see that external validation was never truly about others. It was about their relationship with their own soul. Every time they sought approval, they were unconsciously saying, "I don't trust my own light." Awakening is the reversal of that statement. It's the moment you look inward and realize that the same light you sought outside has always been within. This realization doesn't make you superior, it makes you sovereign. You no longer borrow worth, you embody it. Part 3. The attachment to pain and identity, transcending the shadow. The third thing spiritually awakened people let go of is the attachment to pain, the unconscious identification with suffering as a form of identity. Carl Jung considered this one of the most insidious psychological traps of the human condition, when a person begins to equate who they are with what has hurt them. The pain becomes a story, the story becomes a self, and the self becomes a prison. To awaken spiritually is not to deny pain, but to stop worshipping it. Jung believed that suffering is the raw material of transformation. Without it, there is no awareness, no expansion, no encounter with the self. Yet most people get stuck halfway through that process. They don't transform pain, they preserve it. They build meaning around it, but not healing. The ego, desperate for continuity, clings to pain because it provides identity. It says, I am the betrayed one, I am the misunderstood one, I am the survivor. These narratives, though comforting in their familiarity, prevent psychological renewal. Jung warned that the ego will do anything to avoid dissolution, even if that means identifying with misery. To understand this attachment, Jung looked at the concept of the complex, an emotionally charged cluster of memories, images, and associations centered around a core wound. For instance, a person who felt abandoned as a child may carry an abandonment complex. Whenever life triggers that wound, the complex takes over. They don't just feel abandoned, they become the abandoned child again. Their tone, perception, and choices are all filtered through that lens. The awakened individual begins to notice this mechanism, the way the psyche reenacts old wounds to maintain identity. It's as if the ego says, if I stop feeling this pain, who will I be? Pain becomes a false anchor, a sense of stability in an unpredictable world. Jung wrote that people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls. Facing the soul means losing identification with the familiar self. For many, pain is more familiar than peace. It gives them something to hold on to. That's why healing feels terrifying. It threatens the only self they know. The spiritually awakened person begins to see this paradox. Clearly, the ego would rather suffer predictably than be free unpredictably. The process of awakening requires deep honesty. Jung described it as confronting the shadow, all that we have rejected, denied, or disowned within ourselves. The shadow is not just the dark impulses we hide. It also contains the vitality, creativity, and power we've buried under shame. To transcend the attachment to pain, one must confront the shadow directly. It's not enough to talk about healing. One must face the parts of oneself that benefit from staying wounded. The shadow asks, what do you gain from this pain? The answer is often unsettling attention, identity, justification, or moral superiority. The ego feeds on these hidden rewards. For example, someone who was betrayed may hold on to their resentment because it preserves the moral high ground. They may unconsciously enjoy the sense of being better than the one who hurt them. Or a person who was neglected might cling to the victim narrative because it guarantees sympathy. Jung called this the negative inflation of the ego, feeling special through suffering. It's a subtle form of pride disguised as humility. The awakened individual begins to recognize these dynamics without judgment, realizing that the attachment to pain is not evil, it's protective. It was once necessary for survival, but now it has become a limitation. In depth psychology, this phase corresponds to the night sea journey, the descent into the unconscious where the ego dissolves and the true self emerges. It is here that one encounters not only personal pain but collective pain, the ancestral and cultural suffering inherited through generations. Jung noticed that people often carry wounds that don't entirely belong to them. They are the carriers of unresolved trauma from family lines or the collective psyche. Spiritual awakening involves differentiating between what is yours and what is not. By doing so, the burden lightens and consciousness expands beyond the personal story. Letting go of the attachment to pain does not mean bypassing it. Jung was critical of positive thinking movements that seek to eliminate suffering prematurely. He insisted that pain must be consciously suffered, not repressed. Only by feeling it fully without identifying with it can it transform into wisdom. The difference between repression and transcendence lies in awareness. Repression denies the wound, transcendence integrates it. The awakened person learns to say, yes, this happened, and it shaped me, but it is not me. That simple sentence marks a quantum shift in consciousness. The wound becomes part of the story, not the definition of the storyteller. Jung's concept of enantiodromia, the tendency of things to turn into their opposites, plays a crucial role here. When pain is denied, it dominates. When it is embraced, it dissolves. The act of acceptance releases its grip. Jung saw this as the psyche's natural mechanism of balance. The opposites seek reconciliation. Light without darkness becomes blinding. Darkness without light becomes despair. The awakened person learns to hold both. They stop labeling experiences as purely good or bad and start perceiving them as necessary components of wholeness. In this awareness, suffering loses its identity-making power. The attachment to pain is also linked to the collective glorification of suffering. Religions, cultures, and societies often romanticize the martyr, the tragic hero, or the wounded healer. Jung respected the archetype of the wounded healer. He believed that those who have suffered can heal others, but he warned that one must not become addicted to that role. The healer must eventually heal themselves. Otherwise, their compassion turns into codependency. Many spiritually inclined people unconsciously use pain to feel significant. Their suffering becomes a currency of worth. The awakened individual eventually sees through this illusion. They realize that true empathy does not require perpetual pain, it requires presence. The ego clings to pain because it offers a sense of control over chaos. When you define yourself by your wounds, you know what to expect. There's predictability in victimhood. Freedom, on the other hand, demands uncertainty. Jung compared this transition to crossing a river. You can't reach the other side while clinging to the shore. The awakened person must release the old self to discover who they are beyond pain. This is why awakening often involves a symbolic death, the death of the wounded identity. It feels like loss because it is loss of the familiar self, the familiar story, the familiar suffering. In therapeutic terms, Jung called this psychic death. It's not a literal end, but a psychological reorganization. The ego surrenders its monopoly on identity and allows the self, the total psyche, to take the lead. During this process, people often experience what mystics call the dark night of the soul. It's the stage where pain intensifies before dissolving because consciousness is expanding. The old self resists annihilation, fighting to stay alive through memories and emotions. But eventually the energy behind the pain is integrated, and what remains is clarity. The person no longer needs pain to feel real. One of the most profound realizations of awakening is that suffering is not personal. It is universal, archetypal part of the human experience. Jung's exploration of myths revealed that every culture tells stories of descent, loss, and rebirth. Persephone in the underworld, Christ on the cross, Buddha under the tree. These myths mirror the psyche's journey through pain toward enlightenment. The awakened person recognizes that their suffering is a thread in the collective fabric, not an isolated tragedy. This realization dissolves the ego's sense of specialness in suffering and replaces it with compassion. When pain is no longer personal, it becomes sacred. To transcend attachment to pain, one must stop deriving meaning from suffering alone. Jung warned against what he called morbid introspection, the tendency to stay trapped in analysis without action. People can become obsessed with their trauma stories, endlessly dissecting them without moving forward. This creates what he described as stagnation of the individuation process. True individuation requires integration, turning insight into embodiment. The awakened person starts using pain as fuel for creativity, service, and growth. They ask not, "Why did this happen to me?" but, "What is this asking me to become?" As awareness deepens, one begins to see that pain has a dual nature. It can destroy or awaken. When it is resisted, it festers. When it is faced, it transforms. Jung wrote, "The wound is the place where the light enters you," echoing Rumi's mystical insight centuries earlier. The awakened person lives this truth. They stop running from pain and start listening to it. Pain becomes a messenger, not a master. It teaches discernment, humility, and empathy. Eventually, gratitude replaces resentment because they see how pain shaped their capacity to love. Another key insight from Jung is that the attachment to pain often hides the fear of joy. Joy requires openness, vulnerability, and presence, qualities the ego fears because they threaten control. Pain, though uncomfortable, feels safer. It's known territory. Awakening reverses this dynamic. As the person stops identifying with their wounds, they rediscover the ability to feel joy without guilt or suspicion. They stop waiting for something bad to happen when things go well. They allow light to coexist with darkness. This balance is the hallmark of individuation. Letting go of pain also transforms relationships. Many bonds are unconsciously built on shared suffering, trauma bonding. People connect through mutual wounds rather than mutual growth. When one person begins to heal, the relationship dynamic often shifts. Jung observed that the unconscious seeks balance through projection. We attract partners who mirror our unhealed parts. When those parts are integrated, the projections dissolve and the relationship either evolves or ends. The awakened person accepts this natural evolution. They no longer cling to people out of shared pain, but connect through shared purpose. At the collective level, Jung believed that humanity's attachment to pain fuels conflict and division. Nations, religions, and groups build identity through collective trauma wars, oppression, injustice. Each side defines itself by its wounds, perpetuating cycles of blame. Individuation at the personal level contributes to healing at the collective level. When enough individuals release identification with pain, the collective psyche shifts. The world doesn't change because suffering disappears, but because consciousness changes its relationship to it. Suffering becomes a teacher rather than a battlefield. In practical terms, transcending the shadow involves 3 psychological steps: confrontation, integration, and transcendence. First, you must confront the shadow, honestly acknowledge the ways you've used pain as identity. This requires humility and self-observation. Second, you integrate the disowned parts, allowing yourself to feel without judgment. Finally, transcendence occurs naturally. Pain loses its charge because it has fulfilled its purpose. Jung likened this to alchemy. Base metal suffering transforms into gold wisdom. The ego is not destroyed but purified. The spiritually awakened person no longer seeks meaning exclusively through suffering. They begin to experience meaning through presence, creativity, and love. Pain still arises, but it no longer defines them. When grief comes, they feel it fully without building a temple around it. When joy comes, they embrace it without fear of loss. This fluidity marks psychological wholeness, the ability to move through emotions without attachment. Jung described this as the state of psychic elasticity. The psyche becomes like water, reflective, adaptive, unbroken. Perhaps the most profound sign that one has transcended the attachment to pain is the absence of bitterness. The awakened individual remembers their past without resentment. The story remains, but the emotional charge dissolves. They can speak of their trauma calmly, even gratefully. Jung observed that integration always leads to peace, never arrogance. The person no longer needs to prove their strength through suffering. Their presence radiates quiet power. They embody what he called the wounded healer, healed someone who carries wisdom instead of wounds. In this transformation, even the meaning of forgiveness changes. Forgiveness is no longer a moral duty or a performance of virtue. It's a natural byproduct of freedom. When you stop identifying with pain, there is nothing left to forgive. The offender and the offended dissolve into the same human story. Jung's archetypal lens reveals that every villain is a potential redeemer, every victim a potential teacher. The awakened soul sees the dance of opposites and chooses compassion over condemnation, not because it's noble, but because it's natural to consciousness. This stage of awakening culminates in the realization that pain was never the enemy. It was the doorway. It forced the ego to surrender and invited the self to emerge. The difference between those who awaken and those who remain trapped is not the amount of pain they've experienced, but what they do with it. The unawakened resist, repeat, and relive. The awakened reflect, release, and rebirth. Jung's entire model of individuation can be summarized in that movement, from unconscious suffering to conscious transformation. The person who once said, "Why me?" eventually says, "Thank you." That's not denial. That's transcendence. Part 4. The illusion of separation, returning to oneness. The final thing spiritually awakened people let go of is the illusion of separation, the belief that they are isolated individuals cut off from others, from nature, and from the divine, source of life itself. For Carl Jung, this illusion is the core wound of modern humanity. It is the great psychological split that gives birth to loneliness, anxiety, and meaninglessness. Jung saw this separation not just as a social or philosophical condition, but as a psychic fragmentation, the ego's disconnection from the self, from the totality of being. To awaken spiritually, one must bridge that gap and rediscover unity not as a concept but as a living experience. The illusion of separation begins with the birth of the ego. As children, we experience ourselves as whole. There is no me and you, only the flow of sensation and presence. Then, as consciousness differentiates, the ego emerges a necessary development for survival. The child learns to say I and begins to perceive others as distinct entities. This separation is natural and essential for growth, but it comes at a price, the loss of original unity. Jung described this fall into duality as the beginning of consciousness. We awaken to individuality but forget our interconnectedness. Spiritual awakening, therefore, is not regression but integration, the return of unity within expanded awareness. In Jungian psychology, this return corresponds to the realization of the self, the archetype of wholeness. The self is both the center and the circumference of the psyche. It transcends the ego but includes it. To realize the self is to recognize that the boundary between me and the world is psychological, not ontological. It's a functional distinction, not an existential truth. The ego believes it stands apart, but the deeper self knows it participates in everything. The spiritually awakened person begins to perceive this participation directly through intuition, synchronicity, and moments of profound connectedness where the boundaries dissolve. The illusion of separation manifests in many ways: competition, judgment, prejudice, and even the constant comparison of self to others. Jung observed that these behaviors arise from projection, the mind's tendency to externalize disowned aspects of itself. When you see others as different, less than, or opposed to you, you are unconsciously perceiving your own rejected qualities mirrored back. This is why Jung said, everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. The awakened person stops taking projections literally and starts using them as mirrors. Each relationship becomes an opportunity for integration rather than division. This realization marks the dissolution of duality, the rigid categorization of good and evil, self and other, light and dark. Jung devoted much of his life to reconciling opposites. He argued that wholeness is not achieved by choosing one pole over the other, but by holding both in consciousness. In the illusion of separation, the ego splits reality into binaries: me versus them, spiritual versus material, heaven versus earth. Awakening reunites these opposites. The person no longer seeks escape from the world, but sees divinity within it. The sacred is no longer out there. It's here in every breath, every conflict, every connection. Jung's study of alchemy reflected this union. Alchemists symbolize the end of their work, the conjunctio oppositorum, or union of opposites, as the sacred marriage of the sun and the moon, king and queen, spirit and matter. Jung saw this as the psychological image of individuation, the reconciliation of conscious and unconscious, masculine and feminine, human and divine. To transcend the illusion of separation, the soul must undergo its own alchemical marriage. The awakened person stops identifying solely with the masculine energy of doing, controlling and conquering, and begins to embody the feminine energy of being, receiving and surrendering. In this union, the psyche becomes whole. One of the clearest signs of awakening is a profound sense of interconnectedness with all life. Jung wrote that modern humanity suffers from loss of soul because it has severed its symbolic relationship with nature. The natural world, which once mirrored the inner world, has become objectified, a resource to exploit rather than a living presence to commune with. Spiritually awakened individuals begin to feel the world as alive again. The wind speaks, the forest breathes, the stars participate in meaning. This is not childish fantasy, it's a restoration of symbolic consciousness. Jung believed that the soul perceives through symbols and the world is its mirror. When you see the world symbolically, you no longer feel alone within it. The illusion of separation is also what sustains the fear of death. The ego, believing itself to be the entirety of life, dreads its dissolution. But the self knows that death is not an end, only a transformation of form. Jung, who had near-death experiences, described feeling an overwhelming sense of unity, as if all boundaries of self dissolved into a vast field of meaning. He concluded that consciousness is not confined to the body, it participates in something eternal. Spiritually awakened people begin to live from that awareness even while alive. They lose the existential panic that drives so much of human behavior. The fear of death subsides because they have already experienced the death of separation. At a psychological level, the illusion of separation keeps people trapped in comparison and competition. The ego measures itself against others to affirm its identity. It says, "I am better than I am, worse than I am separate." This dynamic creates endless striving and dissatisfaction. Jung identified this as a sign of one-sided consciousness, when the ego identifies exclusively with the persona and ignores the self. Awakening dissolves that hierarchy. The awakened person no longer sees life as a contest but as a symphony. Every being plays a note in the greater harmony. Some notes are soft, some loud, but all are necessary for the music of existence. Transcending separation also means reconciling the split between spirituality and humanity. Many seekers attempt to escape the human condition through transcendence, rejecting the body emotions or earthly desires. Jung saw this as a spiritual bypass, the ego's attempt to achieve light by denying shadow. True awakening embraces both heaven and earth. The person learns that divinity expresses itself through the messiness of being human, through relationships, mistakes, and imperfection. The illusion that spirituality means detachment dissolves. The awakened soul feels more human than ever, more compassionate, more grounded, more alive. Jung's archetype of the self often manifests in dreams as a mandala, a circular symbol representing wholeness. He discovered that patients undergoing individuation frequently drew mandalas spontaneously, even without knowing their meaning. The circle symbolizes the reconciliation of opposites and the integration of all aspects of the psyche. When one transcends separation, life itself becomes a mandala, a pattern where everything, even chaos, finds its place. The awakened person begins to perceive order within disorder, purpose within randomness. They see synchronicity, those meaningful coincidences Jung described as the language of unity. Nothing is accidental. Everything participates in meaning. One of the deepest expressions of separation is judgment. The ego maintains its identity. By defining what it is not, it condemns in others what it cannot accept in itself. Jung called this the shadow projection. When you hate someone, it's usually because they embody something you've repressed. The awakened person, instead of judging, becomes curious. What is this showing me about myself? This curiosity dissolves judgment and replaces it with compassion. You begin to see that every person acts from their level of consciousness, and that even unconsciousness serves evolution. In this awareness, forgiveness becomes natural, not as moral virtue but as recognition of shared humanity. The illusion of separation also underlies collective conflict. Nations, religions, and ideologies define themselves through opposition. Jung warned that the more humanity represses its shadow, the more it externalizes evil onto the other. Wars, discrimination, and fanaticism are projections of the collective unconscious. Spiritual awakening at the individual level is the antidote. When individuals integrate their personal shadows, they contribute to healing the collective shadow. The battle between us and them diminishes because the psyche no longer divides the world into moral absolutes. Jung envisioned this as the birth of a new level of consciousness, one capable of seeing unity in diversity. Transcending separation does not mean erasing individuality. Jung was clear that individuation is not dissolution into the collective, but conscious participation in it. You don't lose your uniqueness, you express it from unity. The ego transforms from a wall into a window, a transparent structure through which the self radiates. You act as an individual, but you no longer act from isolation. Your actions become expressions of the whole. This is what Jung meant by the self is our life's goal, because it is the fullest expression of what we are. The awakened individual is both distinct and connected, like a wave that knows it is part of the ocean. Letting go of separation also transforms relationships. Love in the unawakened state often operates as dependency or possession, two egos seeking completion through each other. When awakening occurs, love becomes recognition. You no longer love because you need. You love because you see. You see the divine essence in the other and know it as your own. Jung described this as the union of anima and animus, the inner marriage that allows outer relationships to reflect wholeness. The awakened person's love is not attachment but presence. It liberates rather than binds. Each connection becomes a mirror of unity. From a depth psychology standpoint, the illusion of separation also disconnects us from the unconscious. The modern mind worships rationality and marginalizes intuition, dream, and symbol. This creates an inner schism, a war between conscious and unconscious realms. Jung saw this as the root of neurosis, the psyche's natural wholeness fractured by one-sided consciousness. Healing requires restoring dialogue between these realms. Dreams, imagination, and synchronicities become bridges across the divide. The awakened individual listens to these messages, realizing they are not random but relational, the universe speaking through the psyche. Every image, every event becomes a reflection of one's inner state. One of Jung's greatest contributions was his understanding that the psyche is inherently relational. It seeks connection, not isolation. The ego's belief in independence is a defense against vulnerability. To feel separate is to feel safe, but this safety is sterile. It numbs the soul. The awakened person learns that vulnerability is not weakness but doorway. When you open yourself to others, you rediscover your shared essence. The barriers dissolve. Connection becomes effortless because it's no longer forced by need but inspired by wholeness. This is what Jung called the participation mystique, regained consciously the reawakening of unity, but now with self-awareness intact. The illusion of separation also distorts our relationship with time. The ego experiences time as linear, past, present, future, and thus perceives loss and change as threats. The awakened person experiences time as simultaneous and eternal, now in which all moments coexist. Jung's theory of synchronicity hinted at this timeless order. The psyche and the cosmos are connected through meaning rather than causality. When you let go of separation, you begin to experience life as a coherent unfolding. The past no longer defines you. The future no longer frightens you. You live in alignment with the rhythm of the self, which operates beyond chronological time. In practical terms, releasing the illusion of separation means living from empathy rather than ego. You begin to sense the subtle energy connecting all things. Acts of kindness cease to be moral obligations and become natural expressions of unity. Jung noted that individuation does not isolate the individual from society, but deepens their sense of responsibility toward it. When you realize that harming another is harming yourself, compassion becomes instinctive. You no longer need commandments to guide behavior. Conscience becomes spontaneous. This is the maturity of the soul morality arising from awareness rather than rule. As the illusion of separation dissolves, the relationship with God, or the divine also transforms. Jung famously said, "Bidden or not bidden, God is present." He believed that divinity is not an external authority, but an archetypal reality within the psyche. The religious impulse is the psyche's drive toward wholeness. When you are trapped in separation, God appears as distant, judgmental, or absent. When you awaken, God becomes immediate, the living self within and around you. Prayer becomes communion, not petition. The sacred is no longer confined to temples or texts. It reveals itself in the ordinary in laughter, grief, silence, and light. The ego resists this unity because it thrives on differentiation. It fears dissolution as annihilation. But Jung understood that the self does not destroy the ego, it expands it into transparency. The ego learns its rightful place as a servant, not a sovereign. This surrender is the final step in individuation. The ego bows to the self, and in doing so discovers freedom. The individual becomes both nothing and everything, a paradox that cannot be understood intellectually, only lived experientially. The awakened person moves through life with a calm reverence, sensing the invisible threads connecting all things. At this stage, the need for identity itself begins to fade. The person no longer clings to labels, nationality, gender, religion, status. They can still use them functionally, but without attachment. Jung would call this ego relativization. You recognize identity as a tool, not a truth. You can play roles without becoming them. This detachment does not lead to indifference, but to inclusiveness. You can see yourself in everyone, and everyone in yourself. It becomes impossible to dehumanize another, because the illusion of otherness has dissolved. You live not from I am this, but from I am. The awakened person often describes a sense of being lived rather than living, a subtle shift from control to flow. Jung experienced this himself and wrote that the experience of the self is always a defeat for the ego. It's not a defeat in the negative sense, but a liberation from self-importance. Life acts through you. You become an instrument of something greater. This awareness infuses ordinary actions with sacredness. Washing dishes, speaking with a stranger, sitting in silence, all become rituals of participation in the whole. From a depth psychological view, the end of separation also heals the split between masculine and feminine energies within the psyche. Jung emphasized that each person contains both the animus and the anima. When these energies are balanced, consciousness expands. The masculine principle of logic harmonizes with the feminine principle of intuition. Doing merges with being. The awakened person no longer lives in polarity but in complementarity. They see unity not as sameness but as harmony, a dance of differences guided by the same underlying rhythm. Transcending separation also alters the experience of suffering itself. Pain still occurs, but it no longer isolates. The awakened individual feels pain as part of the whole, an expression of life's constant movement. Compassion deepens because you recognize that everyone suffers and that suffering connects rather than divides. Jung believed that the capacity to suffer consciously is the foundation of wisdom. When you suffer without identification, pain becomes empathy, and empathy becomes healing. The illusion of my suffering transforms into awareness of our shared suffering. In the state beyond separation, even language becomes limited. Words like mine and yours lose their emotional charge. You begin to sense reality as energy, not as objects. You perceive patterns rather than fragments. Jung's idea of the collective unconscious points to this field, a shared psychic matrix where archetypes live. When you awaken, you become aware of participating in that field consciously. Dreams, coincidences, and intuitions reveal the interconnected web of life. What once seemed miraculous becomes natural. The universe stops being out there and becomes in here. Perhaps the most striking feature of transcending separation is serenity. The awakened person no longer struggles to fix or control everything because they understand that everything is unfolding within a larger intelligence. They act when moved to act and rest when moved to rest. Their motivation is no longer fear or desire, but alignment. Jung called this living in accord with the self, a state where the individual's will harmonizes with the greater will of life. This inner peace radiates outward, influencing others silently. Presence becomes the message. Finally, as separation dissolves, gratitude becomes the natural state of being. The awakened person sees beauty in everything, even in imperfection, even in loss. Jung once said that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But who you truly are is not an isolated ego, it is consciousness itself. When that realization dawns, every experience, pleasant or painful, becomes sacred. The trees, the sky, the strangers, the challenges, all are reflections of the same self gazing back. The journey of awakening ends where it began, here now, in unity. Every illusion you release brings you closer to your essence, the self, as Jung called it. You're not here to become something else. You're here to remember what you already are. Control fades, validation fades, pain dissolves, separation disappears. And what remains is peace, the kind that doesn't depend on anything or anyone. If this message resonates with you, it means your soul is already awakening. Keep going and trust that the path is unfolding exactly as it should.